I'm Leonie Owiredu, guest host on the new P&L this week, and I'm very grateful you've taken the time to join us today for a roundtable discussion on culture, creativity, and competitive advantage in business. This week, I'm very pleased to welcome Diamond, Gerard, and Rob Scotland. Let's start the conversation by discussing the news and the virus.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gerard Critchlow, and I'm the founder of Working Version, and I'm a strategist that hails from the States. And I've come from other agencies like NPR, Droga5 RJ, AMV, and now I'm doing my own thing. And I'm a cultural strategist that almost looks at culture as stocks, and I try to invest in as many stocks as possible on behalf of companies.
Amazing. Hey, I am Diamond Abdul-Rahim. I am a Londoner and a strategist with a background in social anthropology. I've worked at agencies like RAP and BBH and freelanced, and I am joining Highsnobiety.
And finally, Rob.
Hi, I'm Rob Scotland, head of strategy at McCann London, and very, very privileged to be with the people who I do consider to be the exciting brains, because I'm less so, but I'll see what we can chip in on this.
Yeah, right, Rob. You are equally as exciting.
You'll be the judge of this at the end of the podcast.
Brilliant. Let's start the conversation by discussing the news and coronavirus. So post-election, what are some of the thoughts that we're all having on the initial ramifications of the US 2020 election on the marketing and advertising industry and how we go about marketing and strategy in particular? What are some thoughts that everyone's having?
I think Gerard, as the reigning American, you should have the floor.
So this might be controversial. I think coronavirus was like a blessing in disguise, because I don't know. Do you guys remember what was happening before coronavirus? Well, in the States, it was basically they were killing Black people, and once coronavirus came, there were no more deaths. None of that. Companies were staying home, people were staying alive. They're not killing Black men anymore. So in the States, for me, like coronavirus has been good for that. But and I'm kind of joking, but also in a sense, coronavirus has been a really interesting thing for some of the clients that I have, because it's really forced them to fast forward their plans on innovation and thinking differently. And so for me, while these are things that we've been talking about for years, sort of business transformation, digital first, thinking much more collaboratively in ways that we work, really thinking about mental health as an issue that's been really important to young people and their growth. It's only just happened and become a reality because of the coronavirus. So while it's a terrible thing, I find that there's been some unanticipated benefits as a result of it.
It's really interesting that you made that connection with, like, as the world kind of stopped and took stock of itself because of this pandemic, we became so much more receptive to recognizing everyone else's vulnerabilities and weaknesses across the world. And I think that has happened like on the most extreme level, like we've witnessed with like historic and unrelenting violence against Black people and African Americans in particular, but also in the ways that the pandemic has upended everyday people's lives and exposed the vulnerabilities that they face either in their health and safety or in their position as consumers with financial services, and the loss of their jobs and the ability to carry on and function. So I think that was probably the turning point, was that moment of global like lockdown and pause that forced everyone to kind of like look sideways at each other and take stock. So yeah, I hadn't really like put it together like that, so that's really interesting.
I think March 25th will forever be a day that we'll remember in history because of the killing of a unarmed Black man, unfortunately, by police officers. And the pandemic made sure we were all there to see it, to watch somebody in under 9 minutes lose their life. It's arguable that if the pandemic hadn't have happened, that it wouldn't have had the effect that it's had. There have been other deaths, similar deaths that have happened all over the world. But because we were all there to see it happen, it had a disproportionate impact. And since then, we're really dealing with the ramifications of something which probably has had as much of an effect as on our lives in generations as the Second World War. People can't remember something in their lifetime that had as big an effect, and we're still in the midst of it. And I think it's going to be very interesting because, as you said, people in future generations are going to be sitting there saying, from 2020 to 2023, this happened, and it'll be a blip in history, whereas we're still living it. And I think that has made arguably one of the biggest shifts in social, racial reckoning ever potentially happen. We're at a tipping point. I hope, I pray.
And when we're thinking about shifts, so what has coronavirus, what has the election, what has the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement, how has this changed your approaches as people who work in strategy? How has this changed your strategic approach?
I think firstly, if it doesn't make you more of a realist and incredibly more empathetic with the realization that, you know, your job role and your industry and what you do doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of massive global changes and upheavals, it puts things into perspective in that sense, I guess. And with that comes a new kind of level of being critical of the world and what you can do to right wrongs, whether that's on the work that you produce as a strategist, the power that you might have in your workplace or community, etc. I think for me, it was just the stark realization that, you know, my problems or my job and my work is futile and minuscule against some of the things that the world is going through. And that in itself was like really reassuring to experience.
I think there's strength in even recognizing your role in the world and your place, because for me, like, I think given that, there's also the opposite, the other side of the coin is, man, we can do anything, right? And the role of community is been so much more important, and I'm starting to see so many different business models roll out, new companies form, agencies are beginning to form that we hadn't seen the likes of before. I think there was a dearth of agencies with the founder's name on the door, who still happen to be in that agency, you know, at least in the world of advertising. But you're also seeing sort of celebrities and influencers find new paths to revenue and fame. And I think that's also quite beautiful. So on the one hand, you could say our role is futile, but we've never had the chance or the opportunity to reach and connect with more people than ever. And I think that's also sort of, you know, a silver lining in all of this.
I agree with both sides. I don't think it's either or, but also it's encouraged me to be braver, a hell of a lot braver than I've ever been, both personally and professionally. It's also uncovered some amazing colleagues who are not people of color, but who have recognized some things, have identified some things that maybe they hadn't previously, and are genuinely making a lot of tangible steps towards changing that, which is really gratifying to see. Up until about 2 weeks ago, I didn't realize how much of an effect this year has had on me personally, on me professionally as well. And it's seismic. So I think everything that everybody said, plus the last bit for me is just, I hadn't met the people on this call unless it had been for the ability for networking to happen during the pandemic. So the idea that we can be with fellow strategists and be inspired almost every day, thanks to social media, is something I won't forget for a very long time.
So
Yeah.
if we think about everyone's journey into strategy, what brought you into this space, and what was your first inkling about strategy in marketing and advertising? So what brought everyone to strategy?
Rob, you want to go?
Yeah, I was going to say complete, absolute fluke luck, stumbling, bumbling my way through everything else, getting into arguments with people, when I was younger, sat at the back of the room as a junior salesperson, actually, biting my tongue until I guess my tongue, my mouth nearly flooded with blood when hearing people get things wrong, knowing that I thought I knew better. And then slowly but surely refining that ability to identify and to evaluate and to think about a marketing as a form of getting a product or service into the hands of the people that could make a difference or could at least consume it in an authentic way. And then it took me many years. It actually took a former colleague, Chuck Welsh, who told me I was a strategist. He said, "You know what you're doing is strategy, right?" I was like, "What? No." He said, "Yeah, you're a cultural anthropologist." I'm like, "What?" Went away and read about it. And anything with an ology makes you seem really smart. So I took that straight away.
I think my route was definitely a lot more traditional in that I like discovered it as a uni student through internships, and then just kind of went straight into it as a graduate. But I think the reason why I found it such a compelling role is because you have the ability to like think about people and what they want and need, and that be like the most defining part of what the job is. And I found that like just really cool. And I think for me it gives me the opportunity to be both really cynical about businesses and commercialism, but also incredibly compassionate about people at the same time. And that friction between the both of them just makes it a really interesting job to do, like problem solving for people, but being really critical about your client or what the work is that you're actually doing. So yeah.
Yeah, same. Mine's probably a mix of the two. My path to life as a strategist in the creative industry was born out of frustration. And then, growing up in places where businesses wouldn't serve the communities that I was living in. And then I would see sort of the terrible ads they'd put out or billboards or communications. And I was like, we could do much better than that. I know that there's money here, there's people would love this. Why couldn't they come to our area? So I'm born out of a frustration, but also, as Diamond says, sort of this tension of being a provocateur. It's like, there's got to be another way to do things, right? And so if you can, the things that I saw on TV or ads, I hated them. I was like, well, I could do better. And so the reason why I'm in this industry is to improve it in a sense, and push it in new directions.
When you think about your approach as a strategist, what are some key skills from your experience do you feel is necessary for old strategists to know about, upcoming strategists to learn about, and for the entire practice to know about?
I rate empathy almost above intellect. The ability to feel, to understand, and to be truly cultural. And what I mean by that is the ability to navigate modern culture, I think is as vital as ever. Previously, you could be highly academic and have systems and models, and those things would be true because the media mix was different. The kind of social control was potentially different. But ever since the latest kind of subculture, and I say that over the last 30 years being hip hop, to be blunt, the ability to navigate that requires a different set of skills. And there are some things which translate across languages, across geography, and across social class. And if you don't know what those things are, it's very hard. It's very hard to create strategy that works. The people who do it well, and that's why those brands keep winning in culture, from my point of view.
That pretty much like nails the head on the thing for me about like how what we talk about is being able to like decode different cultural cues and difference and use that as a lens for making creative work. And for me, I think it's like so much of the origins of account planning as this overly intellectualized, really stuffy and exclusionary role, for me, like the most salient thing about how strategy is evolving is having less of the reliance on these overly formalized frameworks and way of doing it. And it literally is just a lot of times the intuition or the hunch or the real empathy that you can see in the work that makes a difference. And I hope that continues, because that for me is what I value most about doing what I do. It's like I have less of, I respect obviously the classics and the fundamentals of how to do things, but it's always about that lateral leap of adding value to the people by making some kind of emotive connection that will always matter above studying all of the books and doing all of the courses and all of that stuff, because that is also a big part of what makes this role really insular and quite exclusionary to like new talent, like young people who might not have degrees or like classic educational backgrounds, but have bags of talent in being able to witness emerging trends or behaviors and interpret that in really interesting ways.
I agree with everything you guys have said. The one thing I'd say is I think it's really important to have curiosity and the perspective of an outsider. So if you believe in design thinking, which I love and believe in, I'd like to consider myself a poor man's designer in a sense. But if you believe in design thinking, one of the principles is that if you're a designer, you have to be able to design buildings, graphics, whatever, even if it's not for you. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of your client or of the other person. And a good strategist is able to do that. So some might, like Rob would say, it's empathy. Some like Diamond would say it's a leap. But at some level, I'd say the thing is do you have the technical ability, the taste, and also the sort of the ability for teamwork? And if you have a bit of all things, all three of those combinations, you can do anything as long as your creativity takes you along that journey.
How are today's creators circumventing traditional paths to success?
Yeah, I like this. I like this question very much. I think when you start to look at the traditional paths to fame, kind of started with the Kardashians in a sense, and what they did with social media on Instagram and Facebook. They've created billion-dollar industries for influencers, right? When I talk to young people now, they no longer want to be basketball stars or play football. They want to be YouTube stars. And that is an amazing shift with only a short amount of time. Remember, social media is only about 15 years old. It's in its teenage years, but it's created billionaires and who have never even gone to university in some sense. And so I think if you can sort of not want to break into an industry like we've all had to do, but if you can find ways to break through it and break out, you can be really creative and find yourself running your own company as a CEO, creating new types of content, using your fans and your followers as a proxy for interest in topics, and then turn that interest in that proxy into a business. And there's so many people doing that now, which I think is an amazing feat.
Mm-hmm.
Just to follow on that, sorry, Diamond, I was going to say, just to follow on that is that the tools at people's disposal now enables that to happen. So the democratization of technology, mobile technology, the high speed internet, those types of things. And then you've got a group of people, to Gerard's point, who are polymaths. So now they can be brilliant at many things all at the same time, whether we're looking at somebody like a Kanye West or a Jimmy Iovine, or, now if you want to learn something, if you want to learn the language, the software is there. You can have an app, you can do so. If you want to learn how to do photography or make music or do anything in the arts or even anything technically, it's very open source now. So you've got a generation of people who've grown up with this ability to be polymaths and are just using the tools at their disposal. To that point, we could create a company now and probably create a product and have it shipped before the end of this podcast if we really wanted to. That's never been possible at any other stage of kind of civilization. I think it's something like, we've seen more innovation in the last 100 years than we've seen in the million that preceded it. So I love this point. It's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add to that, and like the most sort of salient observation that we can make off the back of that is that our whole ecosystem or sphere of influence has completely flipped to like accommodate this. So before, where it used to kind of be like society dictating, and then you have pop culture at large, and then the media and talent or models, and then the self, it's kind of flipped first. So perhaps we can say like we are all kind of creators by default, and we are allowed to sort of mediate our identities through the content and stuff that we consume, and also have ownership attached to it, which is like a really interesting and new development in how like there are new platforms with different kinds of models for content distribution and consumption, and they're always privileging the end user. So it's like we've recognized that we have more power than ever to make things, to create things. And also like concurrently, the separate thought of that is that it's also like there's a lack of gatekeeping now, and that has seen a lot of non-white, non-male people emerge and become those billionaires, like Gerard said. So it's like a literal creators market, and you have the tools at your disposal.
Yeah, I'm just building on that because I find that what Diamond said really interesting is in a world where everyone can create, not everyone should, but it also means that there will be new roles and jobs that are emerging because you have an abundance of information swilling around that it's really hard to differentiate what's important and what's not. And so you'll start to see the role of the curator as being just as important as the creator. And if you do have taste and you do have communities and fans that trust you, you will then rise to the top as a thought leader and as a person who's trusted. And I think that's never changed throughout the industry. Trust has always been something you can bank on. And the people who are the best curators are the most trusted and build the biggest communities. And so you can build your community better than ever if you have taste and trust. So
Culture as a term has become something that you hear quite a lot in the world of strategy, in the creative world in general, and it can sometimes be devoid of meaning. So what does culture mean to you all as strategists? What's the best and most useful definition of culture?
That is a really, really good question. My hope is that it is still at its most macro, a shared sense of beliefs that, again, transcends geography, language, gender, racial kind of ethnicity from that point of view. What I find is that, do you want to tell one quick story just to explain what I think culture is? I was with a CEO and we flew from Copenhagen to New York about 5 years ago. And I was wearing a particular pair of sneakers, won't say the brand. And throughout the whole flight, the CEO was giving me absolute pelters, just like, they're really brightly colored. Brightly colored, what's that? That's not cool. You think you're cool, etc. Well, I like them, so I decided to wear them. We get out at JFK, and a baggage handler is walking past, and he said, "Nice kicks, man." That's culture to me. And because the CEO was like, "Do you know this guy? No. Have you met? No." But in that moment, we shared something that transcended anything that would have gone before. So hopefully, that's my understanding of culture.
My is inspired a lot by postmodernist anthropologies and how they continue to challenge a lot of categories and binaries, and are against the idea that culture exists as this like one static thing that you can identify in lots of disparate places. So the definition that makes the most sense for me is thinking about culture as this like complete shared set of symbols and beliefs and values that facilitate meaning between groups of people. So it's never a specific thing. And my approach to, or how I like theorize culture in my head is not like a catch-all. I'm thinking about young people and I'm thinking about entertainment. It is literally the lifeblood of how everything as humans gets meaning attached and made to it. So like, I like to think of, for example, if I said, what is the culture of the UK? One answer might be like something on the demography, so white Britons and immigrants and the effects of colonialism. Another answer might be the culture of the UK is conservatism, because that party has the biggest mandate. Or another answer might be UK culture is the pub or binge drinking. Like, none of those answers like invalidate any of the other ones before it, but what you're doing is classifying each different kind of bit of information, whether that's political, social, or historical. And I think that's when you kind of have a closer kind of command of what culture is, you can start to unpick all the different levels and who's responsible for bits. But it's literally this really exciting mass and mess of things and meanings, which is why it's probably a really exciting area and field to work in as a strategist.
I agree with all of those things. For me, I try to simplify things, and for me, culture comes down to a sort of one word: caring, right? If you think about it, the clothes that you have on your back, how much thread count is on it, doesn't matter. The colors that you have, who the designer is as humans, like Homo sapiens, we just need something to cover us up. It serves us no purpose other function to keep warm, but we care about these other things, right? And so it's the people who care about things more deeply that create these sort of groups of culture. So that the food that you eat, we all have to eat, but the flavors and the spices that you put in it forms a group of people who care about this one particular thing, and then other groups around that. And so what I think about culture is, what do people care about most? What are they really interested in? And whether that's in the pub culture, or it's sneaker culture, or that might be hair culture, that is what people care about. And so what I'm interested in is, what are the things that are percolating, or I call those signals in culture, that we should be aware of. And those are the things that we should be studying. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the things that we are interested in, but what are other people interested in?
Percolating is such
And thinking about where we map that awareness, oftentimes when we think about culture and cultural relevance, our initial response is to go to where the youth lies. But in some recent research that I've been involved with in grouping generations, it seems that there are areas that we're ignoring. A lot of issues that we are all concerned with, especially now, whether it's banking, whether it's free time and entertainment. We often drill down onto Generation Z and millennials on things like gaming, for example, when actually Generation X are huge gamers. There's a massive market that we're missing out there. So my question to you all is, when we think about defining cultural relevance and where we're going to look for these signals, does it only lie with the youth, and what are the dangers with that?
No, it's a good question. I think my answer is twofold. Firstly, is that especially with subcultures, that's always come from the youth, from the beginnings of time. There you see literacy that says African literacy, people complaining about young people and their ways and those types of things. But also, most recently, I've been looking back in recent history when we think about the 1976 Soweto uprising of apartheid in South Africa, was school children. Tiananmen Square, the young chap standing in front of the tank, the wars have been opposed by young people. But there's something about a young spirit that is immortal from that point of view, often slightly naive and really highly admirable. Now, what I think is happening is that it's very hard to look at culture, or look at even at strategy, through demographics alone. I think now what the problem is, we have to now understand that it's more about shared values, to the point that we said earlier on, but also about the scenario of understanding that a 16-year-old in one place and a 60-year-old in another place can have the same values. So what you're looking for with any strategy is to group around people who have a shared sense of values that we've mentioned before, and reach them, and then reach them effectively and frequently in order to win their hearts and minds. And there's a reason why we say heart and then mind when we talk about that.
I'm so glad that you made that point, Rob, because yeah, I like modern society is literally defined and has been completely shaped by young people, by subversive youth cultures, by like innovations across like every kind of living thing. Yeah, so I completely agree with that. And I also think that maybe perhaps in advertising, when we think about culture, we instantly go to youth audiences because perhaps like there is the idea that we're always chasing the new thing. Perhaps it's partly like that kind of immortal spirit that Rob you spoke about, but I think it's just like a lapse in a real holistic approach to what culture is and means. That means you just instantly go towards young people and what the zeitgeist is there.
Building on what Diamond said and what Rob said is maybe we have to take our hats of youths off for a second, and remind ourselves that we are in a commercial and a creative business. And when businesses begin to look at audiences, they're looking at the size of their audiences, right? But what if we didn't necessarily look at as a size of audience, so we size the cultural opportunity, right? And so a lot of these businesses think that growth is going to come from youth, right? You have graying audiences who probably have a lot more money, but are probably and they have the money to buy it, but the upside is not as large as the upcoming audiences. But if you start to think of it in a different way, as saying what are the interests that our people have, and take culture as a definition, as we all have said, and start to size those interests, you get to see that there are so much revenue opportunity if you can clump together different clusters of interest. And that's how we need to begin to redefine what culture is, because then you can also define the commercial opportunities around that. And that's where the white space is, right? And so if you start to look at a blackboard and there's a little dot on it, and you think that's the dot and you call that youth, guess what? There's a whole whiteboard of white space of all this other stuff that we're just not even looking at, but it's staring us in the face, right? And so we have to reframe our definition of what opportunity looks like.
And in that reframing, how can strategists engage with the youth in non-exploitative ways? And I say this thinking about how the current relationship is with agencies and the creative world and engaging with the youth. It's very much, you have this thing that we need to sell this, so let's get together, use what you've got, and sell this product, and that's where it ends. So how can we create some longevity or a bit more of a consistency with how we engage with youth and youth culture?
I don't think that it should ever be this case of like infiltrate and extract, which is what I feel probably historically it feels like it has been. I think there needs to be a like renewed sense of like respect and inspiration for making these like observations for what's happening across cultures and different demographic groups, but always like attributing ownership to that and not using it as like an exercise for like copy and paste or like take and adapt. Like the idea that, oh, what is X brand's role in this new emergent phenomena, like that needs to end. And the bit that we probably all should be getting better at is feeling okay with just making observations out there in the world and not feeling like they need to be directly attributed to whatever client work you're working on. Maybe like reassessing like those boundaries in how you interpret culture and then like present it back for the commercial work that you're doing. Perhaps that could be one route.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is we have technology now, right? And so as we mentioned earlier with influencers, they're kind of skipping the whole university or job thing and just doing their own thing. And so the role of brands in this new world is evolving. And I think if you're talking to youth, they're going to just skip things and they're going to create things on their own. So if you think of video games, the most successful video game is not, World of Warcraft. It's sort of Minecraft, which is owned by Microsoft, and it made what sort of like 1.3 almost trillion or something, right? And if you go into Minecraft, it's lots of people creating their own worlds, right? You see tools like Roblox now, right, where it's sort of for kids, and the kids are creating their own codes. So companies no longer need to infiltrate, as Diamond said. They need to listen, and they need to observe, and they need to invite in, because the creations are already happening. It's the brands that are more attuned to those signals that are out there that are able to collaborate and provide things that these already brilliant minds are already doing, and give them access to things that they don't have. And so that's very different than in the world we were in yesteryear, or even just 5 months ago, because technology has enabled us to do things in new ways. And I think brands have to evolve and collaborate to catch up.
I'm finding it very hard to improve on what's been said. It's fantastic. I think, yeah, I agree. I agree. Just well said.
And on that point, Gerard, about like brands now kind of taking a step back and knowing how they can facilitate their relationships with their audiences, etc. Like the most interesting and emerging space between that is online communities, and how fandoms have like re-emerged as a real compelling area to watch and pay attention to. And the big difference with it now is that you have people, users, consumers, whatever you want to call them, as these active participants that get to shape the future of X brand, whether that's in products or services, or what they're doing, or how they evolve their tone of voice or personality, for example. And it just points to this new, really interesting level of control that audiences now have over what is happening in the world.
Yeah, and I think the intersection of communities, commerce, and content is really the future that we're going to see, because we're sort of entering this post-social media era that we've all been familiar with, and it's caused us much disdain on our thumbs and our minds, in a sense. And so I think the role of technology has evolved our behavior. It's the first time in history that our behavior is changing, not because we wanted to, but because technology has changed it, right? And that is in that short span of 15 years that we've seen. And so when we're starting to see is sort of this new era of like interactive collaboration emerging. And then that's where the real opportunity is, because no longer do we just want to click and like things. We want to engage with them in different ways. And the technology is allowing us to do that. And that's where those fandoms are becoming increasingly important, because the fandoms that we were saying, oh, we got a lot of followers, that is actually a proxy for success and interest, but also that's the proxy for commercialization and revenue. And so if we can take those fans and those communities, create content for them, and then give them ways to interact with us, that's how we will then sort of make money. And then that's where brands should be sort of their goggles on and intently watching.
I think it's one of those situations of where probably, if not within our lifetimes, definitely within our parents' lifetimes, we've gone from a situation of where the communications structures were quite tightly controlled. So 1 or 2 TV stations, 2 or 3 major newspapers, for instance, to the kind of picture that Gerard and Diamond are painting now. What's really interesting is to see who some of the most compelling people are now, and to see people like an Elon Musk be incredibly ambitious, but also show a willingness to be open source as well, which is fantastic, which taps into the points that both Diamond and Gerard are making. And that's, again, just this concept of ongoing curation, ongoing need to be iterative, but also at times to allow others from anywhere to be able to come in and improve your product or service. I think it's going to have a huge effect upon education, especially the tools that we're using right now. So whereas before a university would have tried to attract a set group of people, maybe from a set demographic, and with a kind of financial capability to pay, now because of technology like Zoom that we're sat on right now, you can go out and attract the best talent in the world anywhere at any time. And that's really interesting to see who will pivot fastest to that, because the pursuit of excellence is still as strong as it's ever been, but there's maybe slightly new rules thanks to some of these tools. So I think it'd be really interesting to see strategies that that capture this, that use this really, really well to achieve a competitive advantage, whether it's commercially or otherwise. So fascinating point.
What value does difference add as a strategic lens from a person or practitioner to their area of inquiry?
So I recently got the opportunity to talk to a bunch of young strategists, and they were working on a brief for a brand that was around a female like safety product. And so I wanted to give them insights to how you can think about contemporary womanhood, but using strategy with an empathetic lens. And how I described it was, you think of yourself as the bodyguard for a marginalized group that you might be working with. I have a particular affinity, especially when I think about female audiences and non-white audiences and young audiences, that my role as a strategist is to kind of protect them and facilitate their best interest with whatever activity is going on, especially when it's not necessarily a clear-cut consumer product and it's dealing with something quite sensitive like your safety as a woman. And so when I talk about difference there, it's like being able to detach yourself and look at the situation from this like bird's eye lens, free of your own kind of biases, and any impulses to draw any quick connections. But at the same time, it's really using your unique vantage point, especially if you're a female strategist or a Black strategist or both, and thinking about what you know about the world that can add difference to this specific bit of work. So the difference and how you articulate that strategically is basically being really having like bags of humility at the point of your briefing or what you're working on, and recognizing the multiple ways into a problem rather than what the biggest opportunity or the easiest fix is. It's being deliberate and slow, which is oftentimes at odds with what traditional agency expectations and pressures are. It's being able to take your time and respect the opportunity, especially when it's has a marginalized audience at its core.
It's really interesting because I think in addition to that, there's no absolutes. I think there are times when you are it. You are the embodiment of whatever that particular target audience might be, and therefore you have insights that nobody else could have. And then there's other times when I think the will to be curious has been talked about earlier, but to also want to be informed is also a huge superpower. In the 1960s, there was a Swedish group of filmmakers. They made a film called The Black Power Mixtape. And what's amazing about that group of people is that they're all white, and they managed to get incredible insights and incredible responses from people on both sides of the civil rights kind of aisle, just by being slightly naive, but wanting to be informed. You've got Richard Attenborough, who directed Cry Freedom, through which I honestly might never have known about Steve Biko, alongside Nelson Mandela being one of the pivotal kind of freedom fighters in South Africa. And Sir Richard Attenborough was a white man. But there's other times when I think to be different means to be an advantage, to think differently, to create a slightly different strategy. And those doors aren't always open, whether it's because of your skin color or the way you think. But I think the organizations who are more akin or more kind of attuned to understanding that they need to have diverse opinion, it's fact, thank you, McKinsey, that they're actually, those organizations are performing better. And I thank McKinsey for that, because people wouldn't believe me if I didn't mention them as an official source.
Just to build on each point, I'd say for me, there's great power in an outsider perspective, because you can often see things that other people can't when they're in it, right? And with that power comes responsibility. And I think, as an outsider, in a sense, if you are that black dot on that expansive whiteboard, you're going to have a different way of communicating in order to make up for that difference, right? And so that's a skill set that we probably haven't talked about here. But if you do have an outsider perspective, you're going to need to figure out a way to connect with other people that they can understand it. And that comes a different skill set that you have to evolve and a muscle you have to grow. And everyone finds their own way into doing that.
And I think this is one of the key aspects about being a Black strategist is that having that different perspective, as Diamond put it, that outsider's perspective is highly valuable. Now, I've lived in Copenhagen, Denmark for the last 13 years. I tell Danes things about their behavior that is just normal to their behavior. They don't think about it. It's as normal as breathing to them. But when an outsider, to your point, Gerard, points it out, they go, oh my God, I didn't think of it that way. That's amazing. So I think for all the young, hopefully young or just kind of not necessarily young, let's not be ageist, to all the strategists out there, I think you have to embrace your outsider, embrace your ability to step outside and to sense and taste and feel and listen to fresh things, because like anything else, you can become slightly desensitized to it. At the same time, there's incredible power from understanding and listening to people who are steeped in a particular subject matter. So for instance, listening to Kamala Harris speak and understanding with great shame that there's not been somebody in her current job title that shares her gender for the last 46 iterations of that job title is something that's a shame. So I hope that she will bring something different to the role of Vice President of the United States. That, I think, proves the point that both Diamond and Gerard have made today.
Also, I think like that being or having that outsider perspective by default suggests that you have these multiple registers to think and interpret the world in. Because I know personally, like my ability to code switch from like workplace strat Diamond to like my ethnic Muslim traditions versus from the elite education that I have been privileged to experience, like those different worlds that you inhabit, they like color and inflect the way that you think about the world, which makes you so much more of an interesting person to solve a problem.
Yeah.
But Diamond also, oh, sorry, I was going to just really quick, but there's a great power to be able to be in a Muslim background, to say Assalamu alaikum, or, you know, inshallah, it will happen. And at the same time, go and eat fish and chips too, which is, and that's the beauty of what I find you're saying. Sorry, Gerard, I apologize.
I just think that makes people more interesting, right? I think if we're going to be spending most of our days, probably more than we see our families, don't you want to be around the most interesting people? And so when you bring outsiders in, it colors your world in a way that you want to spend that time in the pub or the airport with, or a long journey. And that just makes work more fun, right? And I think we should begin to blur the lines between work selves and our personal selves, in a sense, so that we can bring all of those areas to the work that we're creating, which would make it better in general.
And difference also doesn't just mean like your ethnicity or gender or religion or what have you. It's literally like it can be your really niche interests, or the fact that you've switched careers to something else and you're like starting out as a strat. It's like a completely different lens from what we assume the normative approach or kind of core skill set of the strat is, and just challenging that by broadening it out even more.
That goes back to your point about postmodernism, where just you know, which was a rebellion against modernism, a breaking of the norms. What I've been doing quite a lot at the moment is having a lot of conversations with people, because we see so much polarity, is to say, have we ever thought what might be affecting somebody from the other side of the fence? Now, I'm a liberal, you know, that's not, I'm not that special from that point of view. But when you understand what has made fundamentally good people turn to being quite hateful and quite rude and quite obnoxious. And I think that's part of what we're talking about, is then as a strategist having the ability to step outside of the liberal norms, the media that I read and those types of things, and be able to step outside that for 2 seconds and go, okay, this person, what's really driving their hate in this particular instance, or what's driving their reactions, and being able to do that and still, as we've said, maintain your own personal beliefs, I think is a skill.
What has working as a strategist taught you about your value?
About like our personal value system. That's a difficult one.
It is.
Personally, I think for me, it's illuminated and challenged my belief systems and ways of working. I'd say it provides a framework for looking at certain things in a sense, and then others it makes me say, why do I think that way, or why do I behave that way, and not necessarily impose the lens that I've come from to where I necessarily want to be. And so it could be freeing in a sense. A prism of freedom is how I'd say strategy has made me look at things and behave in different ways. But also, I think partly it's moving from one continent to another. So, I'm American and I live in London. What I found was that we both speak the same language, but we don't say the same thing. And at some level, I challenged myself, why do I think that way? Like, that's kind of silly, right? And that, so strategy in a sense has helped me to understand myself and challenge the way I think and do things.
It's definitely humbled me, I think. Born in East London, where you can think the whole world kind of revolves around you when you're a Londoner, to some extent. And then you go to New York and you meet people who feel the same way there, or you go to Paris and people feel the same way there. But what strategy has continually done is help me mature, help me be humble, but also help me be infinitely more curious than I would have been otherwise. And I really love that. That's why I pay tribute to the people on this call, because they've helped me in the last 12 months or so acclimatize to the idea of working in London, where I've been living in a different city and part of a different culture to some extent. So without that humility, without thinking I have all the answers, it's the opposite. It's no, please tell me. I would like to know. I would like to hear what you have to say. And that's what strategy has definitely given me over the last 12, almost 15 years.
I would definitely co-sign both of those answers. I think, yeah, it's just made me have a lot more humility. And also, like, it can feel really overwhelming to feel like your job function is like how your series of hunches or intuition like provides the answer for X bit of problem or thing that you're working on. That can feel really scary at times, and especially when you're like a young Black woman occupying that role where it's traditionally kind of described as being sort of like the brains of X thing. It can lead to a lot of imposter syndrome and self-doubt. But for me, I feel like I have kind of just taken hold of that and turned it into, I feel comfortable not knowing the right thing all the time, because I'm committed to learning new things and staying curious. So I'm less concerned about feeling like I have the clever answers or the right answers. I'm in it just to figure things out. And I think that's really reassuring.
Brilliant. This past summer, we all saw many Black squares on this fateful day in June, where brands were taking a stand with the Black Lives Matter movement and standing against police brutality. And we saw this manifest in some drastic hierarchical changes. All of a sudden, Black people were found to be in managerial positions, or just employed more than ever this past June. So what were your initial thoughts about this restructuring that was going on this summer?
I'm really glad that I was hired before the summer. Otherwise, I'd be worried. Well, hang on a minute, 1 second. No. I try to stay on the side of optimism, because what I think we're about to see is that the good people especially the good people of color who maybe have got fresh opportunities that weren't there previously, are going to absolutely fly. It's not even an issue or a problem. The issue of qualification, that's not the case. So I'm really looking forward to that. I've got my popcorn ready to see that, and like three of the people on this call. And what I think we have to do is balance the emotional trauma that we've been through this year with the optimism to show what we can do, not to anybody else, but to ourselves. And then make sure that we keep the door open for the next generation. There's something amazing. I keep coming back to Kamala Harris because it's amazing just to see what representation means in a live context. It's highly important to see people like Diamond Abdul-Rahim win awards and be highly decorated. And I could not give a damn how old you are. You're a flipping genius as far as that's concerned. Those things mean something. And I think that what it will continue to do is to build our own self-confidence as people of color, as people of many different colors and backgrounds. And that will be a wonderful thing to see. But I'd like for us to do it on our own terms, not because we wish to be anything or anybody else. And I speak in code when I say that.
How is this time different? How's this time different though? And what are some things that organizations can do to foster long-term changes?
I think anything that meaningfully platforms and celebrates and pays Black people, I'm a fan of, like unconditional support. I think also when we think about like organizations, and particularly in the creative industry, and their commitments to D&I more broadly, or making their declarations of allyship like concrete plans of action, that is still a huge work in progress, because one of the saddest casualties of COVID-19 has meant that it's the junior and midweight people at agencies in particular where that's the bulk of the sort of non-white and non-traditional background entrants have lost their jobs as a result of this pandemic. So we are losing future generations of talent that are non-white and really fucking clever and cool and interesting. So it would be interesting to see how like agencies in particular respond to this in the coming years. But I think it's hopeful, it's positive, and it's always good to feel like you are finally being respected and seen and given the things that you deserve.
Yeah, I found that companies have been, we work in the creative industry, but companies haven't necessarily been creative in finding great talent. They've kind of gone to the same pool that works and to their networks. What's been really interesting from my perspective is that they're starting to open up how they look at talent and be more creative in finding new voices and new ways of doing things, which I think is brilliant. It's just a little sad, right, to say that like now you guys are thinking of things differently. But I kind of come from the Saul Alinsky school of thought, who was sort of Obama's sort of inspiration as a community organizer. And what he would say is things have to get really, really bad before they can get really, really good. It's because that's when people are most interested and willing to change, right? And let's just admit it, like it's pretty bad. Things are pretty bad, but guess what? There is a phoenix rising from the ashes. And while we may be losing strategists, to Diamond's point, in the sort of the junior and the midweight levels, they're going to end up somewhere else. And that somewhere else will be better. And perhaps some things need to die in order to birth something new. And so the agency structures and the way they are now, that cannot live the way it has. And so we need to reimagine and reassess and rebuild new ways of doing things. And I think I'm hopeful for that.
How has workplace culture impacted how strategies roll out pre-COVID and during it?
Good question. I think the thing I personally see is the one thing a lot of business leaders need is strategy. And the thing they're craving are answers, hypothesis, plans, potential, ideas of ways that they can navigate their business through these incredibly uncertain times. So therefore, being a strategist is amazing from that. I've never used the word hypothesis more than I have in the last kind of 2-3 years, and definitely during the pandemic. I mean, it's amazing. So from that point of view, certain rule books are being torn up and kind of put together again. That means there's an opportunity to be additive to a business, and that's one of the things that I try and push a lot to the students that Damin and I share, and some other students as well, is to try to be additive with your ideas and your strategies to a business. A business is trying to achieve a commercial end. To Gerard's point earlier on, it is possible to do so authentically, without doing too much harm, at least, and making sure that you can entertain and engage along the way. And that's what I think is fantastic about strategy right now.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand there's different types of strategies. And I think in the advertising world, we really sort of extol the benefits of being a brand strategist. But in a world where brands are commodities, brand is not going to be as important, and you're going to need to understand different strategies and your strengths. And so you might need to understand business consulting. You might need social strategy. You might need to really stop leaning on the post of the brand and look at how people engage with that brand. And so what is that brand's ambition, but how do you execute that ambition? That is where people will begin to understand the strength of a brand, in a sense. And so if we don't come from a traditional brand strategy background, good news is you can do lots of other strategies. And that means there are different roles that you can play into as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing to add on that. I think you guys both nailed it. And also, yeah, like it's not like brand strat isn't the be all and end all. Like I started out at a direct marketing agency where just understanding all of the like really one-to-one ways that you talk to your customers and what you do post-purchase and nurturing a relationship, that stuff has been really invaluable to how I like come up and think about above the line, big creative glossy work, etc. So I think, yeah, just making sure that strategy is a plural role or function that can mean many different things, and just always having like at your disposal a bunch of different types of specialists and generalists too, just anyone who has their own unique point of view on what strategy should be.
Is the creative industries ready to embrace the diversity that it's calling out for? How has your experience shaped your perception of what the landscape could be?
I want to say like yes and no, and only because like in my short agency experience to date, I have never like as a Muslim person seen Eid or Ramadan on any kind of planned activity, any kind of big national brand or client. It's always like a last minute additive for, oh, could you pull together some insights and stuff? So it's like if internally you aren't thinking about how to like pitch proactive ideas to your clients and push who and what you're talking to in your comms, if you're not doing that through the work, then perhaps like you're not doing that in a meaningful level for your organization or company too. Like the two have to work hand in hand. It's not just about trying to get non-white people in the doors. It's also about like what the output looks like for your work and who you're talking to beyond just casting Black or mixed race people in adverts.
This goes back to an earlier point. Oh, sorry, Gerard. This goes back to your earlier point, which is just if you are curious, if you are informed. I am not Muslim. I know two things about Ramadan. First, all of my Muslim friends can tell me the exact minute that the sun sets every day during Ramadan. And two, well, three things actually. Two, the food that gets laid on as soon as the sun sets every day during Ramadan is something to behold. And third, if you've not been to an Eid dinner party, you've not lived. So if you are a supermarket who has any kind of commercial sense, you might want to think about, if you're within arm's reach of anybody of a Muslim background, you might want to think about learning the commercial opportunities behind Ramadan from that point of view. And the same thing goes to understanding people's sexual orientations or gender or color or class. If you're informed, exactly as Diamond said, there's so much opportunity for your business. And guess what? If you don't do it, somebody else will. That's the bit that you've got to be alive to right now.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is we're in advertising, and maybe advertising is the wrong sort of umbrella for what we're thinking, but it's an ideas business, right? But it's not necessarily just an ideas business. It's the distribution of those ideas. That's the business that we're in, and there's so many different channels to distribute these ideas. If you think of that and apply it back to an agency structure, if you do have insights, let's say around Ramadan, how are you going to distribute that idea to the decision makers within your agency or your company? Because that's actually the art, right? So I'll give you a quick example. I was in an agency, they were doing a piece of work. I did not necessarily agree that that piece of work was culturally representative of stories of people of color in the United States. And I said, you know what, guys, I think we can tell different types of stories, right? This is probably playing into a stereotype. But then when I started to look around at the people who are the creative directors and the clients, and then the other people who were sort of in charge of those accounts, and I explained this idea, none of them could relate to it because they didn't understand it. They did not have the cultural context nor the sort of, aptitude to take that in. And so how I had to distribute that idea literally became a daisy chain, and I had to get creative about helping people understand what they could not. And I think the job is, when you are people of color or of a different background or of a different sort of economic standpoint, people may not understand where you're coming from, and you have to be creative about distributing those ideas. And so when I say I'm optimistic, but I'm also sort of not pessimistic, but skeptical, is because the current agency structure or creative structure isn't necessarily set up in order to receive those distribution of ideas. And that's what we need to work on.
What do we think the world of strategy will look like in the future? What are some optimistic opportunities for the future of strategy? And what does strategy need to do to cement itself as a key component for the future?
I can go. Okay. For me, I'm really excited, but I'm always optimistic. I think I'm one of these optimistic people. I'm really excited because I think what is happening within strategy right across the board right now is that it's proving itself to be an immediate competitive advantage. And that is really, really interesting. I think we are about to enter the era of the strategist, so to speak. It's going back to the point that Gerard made earlier on about the curator, the person who has good taste, the person who understands and can navigate culture. I think they're going to get more, the more we've lent on data and the ability to have machine learning and that kind of understanding, the more we're understanding about that is it depends what you put in. And the more informed you are, the more you understand, the more culturally fluent you are, the better I think your results can be. And therefore you got, those people, they're thin on the ground. You got some people who are really good at hyping something, and you got some people who are really good at studying something. But the person who sits in the middle, the person who can see something as it's emerging, capture that insight and be able to turn that into a strategic move of some sort, that's really, really valuable. And whether it's the military, sports, brands, advertising, those people are increasingly valuable because they give you a competitive advantage that others simply cannot.
I hope in the future strategy is less decks, less frameworks, and much more really an interrogation of what currently is, and reimagines what could be. If you really just think about that, strategy is, to me, is a set of decisions that we have to make. And if that box that Rob is talking about is about inputs that are grabbing from different places in culture and different ideas, what decisions are we going to make based on those inputs? And we don't need a framework to help us understand that. We don't necessarily need it to be glossy. We just need it to be sharp and creative. And that's what I'm hoping for, to simplify things.
I would hope that empathy and critical thinking are the sole core defining competencies for a strategist. And I also hope that it becomes a bit more scrappy and experimental, a bit like Gerard saying, like less decks, just vibes, like just a real closer attention to people and ideas, an idea generation for the sake of thinking about what can be possible. Like, yeah, just being a bit more scrappy and playful.
Vibes, 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 vibes. I love it.
A big thank you to all of my amazing guests today. Thank you for your time and for your wisdom. If you'd like to find out more about what Diamond, Gerard, and Rob do, please check out their website links in the notes of this podcast. As I mentioned in the introduction, please do take a moment to review us. We generally appreciate it and it makes a big difference. If you'd like to subscribe, go to www.principlesandleadership.com. Finally, I'm Leonie Owiredu, guest host of the new P&L. Thank you once again for listening and have a great day.